Caledonian Railway 956 class. In before someone's like, it's actually Caledonian Railway or something. I think it's a hard C, but it might be a soft C. You know, C's are funny like that, but I always thought it was Caledonian. So I'm going to go with that. It doesn't really matter. 956 class. These were 3-cylinder 460 steam locomotives, and they were used on the Caledonian Railway from 1921. They were also the largest design operated by a Scottish railway. They were pretty big locomotives. They were very large and impressive. And in terms of, like, their appearance, yeah, that stuck. Like, they were good-looking trains. Also, they were really just freaking terrible. They were described by several authors in various ways, but one of the quotes I'm gonna list is that monumental flop of all time, or as ineffectual giants. So, yeah, the biggest problem with these is their inability to steam. A steam engine, as I'm sure most of you are aware, require, steam to operate, and a big part of that is building steam pressure, and for various reasons, these engines just could not maintain steam pressure. Firemen always struggled to keep them up to pressure for them to actually, function. They couldn't build enough steam. That was major, and, that's on top of the other minor problems, like too small of an ash pan, which caused choking in the grates. That was good too, why not just add that on top of it? And they never really got any better, unfortunately. Because they were non-standard, they weren't even considered to be rebuilt, so they were just withdrawn. And as far as I can tell, they were scrapped. There were only 4 of them, so, The British Rail Standard Class 8. Why do you hate me? I don't try to hate you, but you're pushing it. You really are. In fact, I chose this one specifically to avoid a diesel, and yet it's still you. You didn't even just fail at diesels. I mean, you did. There's plenty more of those. But the Class 8 is a steamer. A really impressive-looking steam engine. How do you... Ugh. I can't deal with these people. I can't deal with them. I don't want to address it anymore. It's just a thing that keeps happening to me. There's no escape. The Class 8 was a single example of a locomotive. A 462 Pacific. Was built in 1954. It's also known as the Duke, and I'm just going to keep calling it that. Rather, Duke of Gloucester, I think is how you say that. The British people are going to be like, actually it's pronounced Gloucester or something. I'm sorry, I'm American, leave me alone. We already won the revolution. I'll throw the tea in the harbor again. Don't you tempt me. The Duke had significant issues when it was first introduced. It was a poor steamer from the get-go, but on top of that, it also had heavy fuel consumption. Large engines tend to be that way, but if you're going to be taking a lot of fuel, you better be working. And it didn't steam well, so it was eating fuel and not actually doing anything as a result. The poor draughting of the locomotive meant that it couldn't adhere to timetables very good, and even though British Railways did take some evaluations to try to see what they could do, they got nothing but negative feedback. And it only operated for 8 years. Now you'd be curious as to why these photos you're seeing are actually all really recent, like they're in color and in, good definition. Like, these obviously weren't taken in the 60s, so what gives? Well, the Duke actually stands as a pretty wholesome story when it comes to train history. He was originally going to be scrapped. He was sent to the Woodham Brothers scrapyard in Barry Val of Glamorgan, South Wales. But a group of railway enthusiasts actually became wise to this and decided to purchase it outright. They spent the next 13 years refurbishing it and making modifications to the design. The result is that nowadays, and yes, the Duke still runs, it's actually one of the most efficient and powerful steam locomotives to ever run on British railways. Class 8 is a testament to what happens when people who really love trains and locomotives and all things going into rail fanning, or whatever you call it, come together to do something great. And I just love the massive fail on British Rail's part here. Like, okay, you guys couldn't figure out how to make this steam engine work. You didn't bother with it, you decided to scrap it. So a bunch of rail fans who just care. Like, they just care. Choose to spend their own money, buy the engine, spend 13 years fixing it on their own, and make it run better than you ever could. To the point that it still runs now. Wow. Look, I mean, I'm all for a win on the rail fans' part here. This is wonderful, but also, like, how inept are you people? Why are you doing this to me? Why are we having this conversation again? Every single list, I look at your stupid logo, and every single time you have disappointed me. Why are you the way that you are? It's what I want to know. The Fontaine 440. Sorry, I can't even look at it. Give me a second. Okay, I trust you has the questions here, and I don't blame you. What the heck is going on with this thing? Well, a little backstory. Alright, so the Fontaines were a pair of engines built by the Grant Locomotive Works. They were designed by Eugene Fontaine of Detroit. Although they're a French design, they were built in America, so I don't know who can be blamed for this. I'm just gonna go with Eugene Fontaine for it. We're not gonna get national about this. We're just gonna say it was Eugene's fault. So Eugene really thought that this was a good idea. So you're probably wondering what's going on with the extra wheels and why they're not on the ground and what the deal is with the cylinder being, up like that. Like, that's not nothing about this is normal, is what I'm trying to say. So the crank turns the wheels like a normal engine. You can see it there. That wheel moves, and then because it's touching the lower wheel, it will turn like a gear, except like not like a gear because there's no pegs like on a gear, and that will drive the engine forward. Now you may be wondering, well, what the heck is the point of that? Because why not just angle it downwards like a normal steam engine and just, move the driving wheels directly? This is an excellent question, and I will give you the answer that I have been given, which is a really dumb one, but this is honestly what Eugene thought. Eugene Fontaine's explanation is that he felt this design would actually increase the speed of the engine overall. Quite why he thought this is anyone's guess, because the Fontaines weren't any more capable than a normal steam engine at that time. Like, the Americans that, the Fontaine is very similar to, and was eventually rebuilt into, was just as capable as this weird, off-putting, bizarre technique of, like, having the wheels together. And in fact, this is arguably worse, because you have these wheels touching each other, and the drive is dependent on those wheels being in contact. That means that there's just another surface where wheel slip can occur. Like, the wheels aren't like gears, there's no pegs, like I said, so if the wheels slip, like, it's just one more thing that can go wrong, for literally no benefit. Like I said, they were rebuilt into conventional American types. 440s again, but with like the cylinder and the crank and everything in the right place. And when they did that, they were fine. Like in terms of like their actual inner workings, their boilers, everything like that, they're pretty much okay. Like they weren't anything terrible or exciting in that regard. It's just this weird thought that Eugene had with the wheels being. I don't know why you thought that was gonna work. The IC4, manufactured by the Italian train company Ansaldo Braa. Okay, I'm gonna be real here. This is one of the most recent things I've ever discussed on this channel. And in fact, this is the first time, unless you count the Pacers, which I'm pretty sure have all been withdrawn by now, this is the first time where we're talking about a train that is technically still in service. This thing is still being used. And there's a lot to unpack in this topic, and I assure you, there is no amount of, fast talking that I can do that will really explain what a absolute mess this entire story is. So I'm giving you a very, very, very abridged version of the events involving the IC4. Now, the IC4 was manufactured by Analo Braa, like I said, and it was meant for the Trans-Great Belt routes of Danske Statsbaner, which is Denmark's national railway operator. We're just going to call them DSB because Lord knows I've already mispronounced it. And in fact, I may mispronounce a lot of things because I don't speak Danish. These trains were purchased under DSB's Good Trains for Everyone plan, which is really wholesome, and I like it. But this didn't go well, because the original contract said these things were supposed to enter service in 2003. And it wasn't until 2007 that the first train set, because they were sold in sets, finally entered service for testing. So we're already, 4 years late. And that's just one train. They ordered many that weren't delivered. And believe me, this controversy runs deep into government corruption and fraud claims and a whole bunch of other things involving Analo Braa, where they just seem either sketchy at best or just really inept. Perhaps both, because the government of Denmark had spent a great deal of money on these new trains, as did the DSB. Yet, the trains weren't being delivered, and even the ones that were suffered serious mechanical issues. It didn't help that they already had to spend money lengthening the platforms just for these new trains, so they spent all this money to set things up for them, and when they were delivered, they were late, and they weren't working. They suffered many electronic issues mostly, and as well as an overabundance of exhaust, which these are supposed to be environmentally efficient, so good work there, guys. One of the more alarming flaws was that there's an onboard computer system that's supposed to help stop the train if there's a signal that says to stop. Well, apparently this system has a bunch of bugs, because 2 of the trains blew through stop signals. This resulted in the entire fleet, this was in 2011, so they had a few more, like 17 or so, give or take. They ordered like 70, by the way, just so we're clear, being taken off the rails until they could figure out what the heck happened, because they're lucky nobody was killed. And like I said, this story goes on and on and on to the point that it became not even worth it. What was worse is that in 2014, it got to the point where not only were the trains, such a pain in the butt with their constant mechanical issues, but they couldn't even be scrapped, because if they scrapped the trains, the amount of money they would get back would nowhere near cover their operating costs. And the DSB would have to file for bankruptcy if that happened. Like I said, this is a serious abridged version of these things, and they are still currently used, but right now the DSB plans to phase them out by 2024 because they're just not worth it. Hilariously, one of the amazing controversies here is that one of the trains that was supposed to be given to Denmark was actually given to the former dictator of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, in 2009 by the Prime Minister of Italy, Silvio Berlusconi. Now, seriously, I'm not making that up. Now, here it is on Google Maps. It's right here. It's still there, sitting there. This is such a... wow. I don't even know where to begin. I honestly never thought I'd ever talk about a train that was still being used on this series, but this is such a meat of a topic that I just couldn't resist. Kind of feel bad for Denmark. Believe it or not, this is not the only bad train that Analo Braa delivered to a country in Europe. The Analo Braa V250, or the NS High Speed V250, is another high-speed train that Analo Braa was contracted to deliver to a country in Europe, in this case Belgium and the Netherlands. And I bet you can't guess what happened. No, I bet you can't. Delays. Constant delays. And in this case, the trains were even worse. That's why it's in the #1 spot. Because these tended to, just fall apart. Now, really, like, some of the floor plates were found falling out of them. Like, really. They were terrible. If you're wondering why these countries seem to keep contracting Analo Braa, even though they seem really bad at their jobs, well, this is only in the last 2 decades. Before all this happened, Analo Braa wasn't that bad of a company. They actually made trains that were, halfway decent. So it wasn't like their history suggested that this sort of thing would happen. However, I do want to point out that there was a bidding war to do these contracts for these countries between several companies. 2 of the companies in particular are actually a little familiar. Alstom bid to do a train, they made the French TGV, and Siemens input a bid, and they did the German ICE trains, both of which were alarmingly successful. Analo Braa underbid the competition and said that their train would be faster. So let's think about that for a second. You're a company that's bidding lower than everybody else, but saying your train's going to be better for less. Because I don't know how familiar you are with, exchange of, commerce and things like that, and economics and capitalism and all this stuff. But generally, you get what you pay for. And if you're paying for less, you're gonna get less. And that's absolutely what happened here. The trains are complete garbage. They had numerous technical problems, and hilariously, when Belgium called out Analo Braa on this, Analo Braa tried to blame them for running the trains in the snow, even though the trains were supposed to be capable of handling the snow, because I don't know if this is news to any of you, but it snows in Belgium. That's your problem. Oh, you ran into the snow. You shouldn't have done that. Dude, it's Belgium. Of course there's snow there. Are you saying your train can't touch snow? Because I got news for you, you're selling to a place with snow. Like, you can't blame them when you specifically state that the train should be able to handle that. Like, that was one of the requirements, and you didn't deliver. Analo Braa, by the way, isn't really a thing anymore. It was purchased by Hitachi Rail, actually, in 2015. Hitachi is another rolling stock manufacturer. They're Japanese. So from what I can tell, most of their deliveries have been pretty good, so hopefully now that they're under new ownership, Analo Braa can stop messing around and screwing people over. The London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway I1 class. Now, before anybody gets crazy, no, this is not a picture of an E2. Look at the wheels. It is different. Though, admittedly, the body does look a little bit similar to the E2s. But these are not E2s, these are I1s. They were 442 tank engines. They were supposed to be able to haul secondary passenger trains as well as do shunting work and things like that. Most things that tank engines are supposed to be for. They were built between 1906 and 1907, and, you know, they didn't go well. They were, I don't know if it's just this cutesy shape that keeps happening where if it looks like an E2, it's not supposed to do well, but the I1s are actually a lot worse than the E2s in my opinion. In fact, they were so bad that they were reportedly given the nickname, and I don't say this lightly because, you know, I don't try to use coarse language on this channel, but this is historically relevant. The crews gave them the nickname Wankers. Yes, really. The reason is they were awful. They couldn't steam effectively. And, you know, when a tank engine can't do that, that calls into question some serious concern, because tank engines are small, so they shouldn't have an issue building up steam pressure. But for whatever reason, the I-1 just couldn't deal, and this is due to its boiler design. The boilers just weren't efficient at all, and required too much heat from the firebox in order to build up pressure. Now, to the I-1's credit, they were later rebuilt in the 30s, and they were redesignated I-1Xs. Ooh, edgy. But they were much better in this form. Their boilers were switched out. They lasted until the 40s then. They were withdrawn by 1951. And none survived into preservation, in case you're wondering, because, you know, I mean, they got better. That's why they're low on the list. They were awful, but they got better when they became something slightly different. But, you know, whatever. It still counts. Don't yell at me. The Erie L1 class. Ooh, I'm excited. I get to talk about Camelbacks now, because you're probably looking at this and you're saying, what the heck is that? Okay, backstory. Camelbacks are a specific type of steam locomotive that is sometimes confused with camel locomotives. They are not the same thing, even though some people use the terms interchangeably. That's wrong. It's horribly wrong. But they do have one thing in common, and that's the general X-axis placement of the cab. The reason they're called camels and camelbacks is that the cab is placed in the middle of the locomotive. In the camel's case, the cab is placed on top of the boiler. The reason for this was to put as much weight on the driving wheels as possible. Camelbacks are similar, but their cabs are actually built around the boiler towards the middle. And the camels and the camelbacks were built for two different reasons. Like I said, the camels were built to put as much weight on the driving wheels as possible. Camelbacks were created out of necessity to add a larger firebox to the locomotive design. The initial problem came down to the need for a firebox that could burn anthracite waste. Now, anthracite is a form of coal, just so we're clear. Now, the firebox could be built, but it required a very large model. So large that if you put the firebox in a traditional place in front of the cab, the driver couldn't actually see forward. So the idea was to simply move the cab in front of it and keep the fireman back behind so he could shovel in coal. That's where the Camelbacks design comes from. There were a few different ideas involving this, and one of them was indeed the Erie L1s. Now, the Erie L1s are an insane 0880 steam locomotive. They were the only articulated Camelback locomotives ever built, and when they were built in 1907, they were literally the largest steam locomotives in the world at that time. Now, the Camelbacks in general have some issues, and so do the Camels actually, and it's mainly down to safety concerns. For one thing, the placement of the cab here puts it in spitting distance of the side rods. Crews were worried that if the side rods snapped at any point due to a mechanical failure, they would get, well, impaled. Which does happen. Not the impaling part, but the side rod snapping part. But normally they're in position behind the locomotive that this wouldn't be a concern. But with Camelbacks, that was something that was possible. But the bigger issue was the location of the crew members. As you know, the basic steam engine will have at least two crew members, the engineer and the fireman. In a traditional steam locomotive, they would occupy the same place. But on a Camelback, that can't be done because the firebox is behind the cab. The fireman would be behind between the engine and the tender, taking care of the firebox, while the engineer would be, doing his job in the cab. But this meant that the crew couldn't communicate effectively. There were no radios back then, and steam engines are pretty loud when they're going. So, in a situation where there was an emergency, the crew wouldn't be able to tell each other what was going on. It didn't help that the poor firemen, with a lot of the Camelback designs, were exposed to the elements. There wasn't really much in the way of shelter back there. So if it was raining, the fireman was just got out of luck and just had to deal with it, where the engineer was mostly comfortable. Either way, for this reason, this design never really took off in terms of Camelbacks in general. As for the L1 specifically, the reason they didn't take off is that they were just, well, this is weird. They were too powerful. Like I said, these were the biggest locomotives in the world at the time, and they made a haul an incredibly large amount of weight. Now, they could do this, but their problem was that it was almost impossible to stoke a fire hot enough to meet their capabilities. Because the firebox was enormous on these things, it meant that the firemen had to work really, really hard. On top of that, as time went on, more efficient designs came out that were just as strong, if not stronger, with smaller fireboxes due to, different design mechanics and changes to the locomotive infrastructure overall. The fact is, the L1s just didn't do what they were supposed to do effectively because they were too hard to work with. There are actually rumors that this locomotive's firebox actually required 2 firemen to work it. Now, I will tell you, A, that's not true. At no point is there any evidence to suggest that there were 2 firemen working on these things. Although, B, that may have actually fixed the issues. They would have had to pay another fireman, which, make operating costs a little more expensive. But if there were 2, maybe they could have gotten away with this locomotive's insatiable hunger for constant, unspeakable heat. But the fact was, they just didn't function the way they had hoped they would. They weren't efficient at all. No matter how powerful they could be, the amount of effort that it took to get them to work just didn't mean anything. Eventually, they were actually rebuilt as 2 882s with more conventional rear-located cabs. They wound up being more efficient in this form, but even then, by the 30s, their designs were obsolete, and they were all scrapped. The British... You know what? No! The British Rail Class 43, also known as the Warship Class. I want it on record that I would seriously rather gargle battery acid than talk about British Rail for one more waking moment of my life. So what's wrong this time? History in the dark, please tell us! Tell us now! Please, we have to know! We have to know how they messed up. It's so important to our daily lives. Fine, you wanna know? These were... Well, okay. Class 43 was part of the modernization plan that was meant to replace all the steam engines in one sweeping motion, where they would create a bunch of diesels that would do all the jobs the steam engines used to do. It's going to be perfect and happy, and nothing, went right. They were diesel hydraulic, which is already a questionable decision, as people have pointed out that they were way, way too high on maintenance, but that is really not the problem with the Class 43. Now you're probably wondering, why are they called warships? Well, it's actually quite simple. In the UK, most trains are given actual names, and in this case, this class was named after warships within the British Royal Navy. Also, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think the Royal Navy deserves better than to be associated with these glorified pieces of scrap metal, but that's just me. Also, they shouldn't be confused with the Class 43 HSTs, because those are completely frickin' different, and I don't know why they're called the same thing. But yeah, they're not the same thing. Those are actually good, for one. Now the real question is, what specifically is wrong with the warships? Okay, so Class 43's biggest issue was down to how they were built. They are extremely similar in design to the Class 42 warships, which are almost exactly the same in many regards. Now you may be wondering, well, what's wrong with the 43s if they're so similar to the 42s? Well, the 42s were built by Swindon Works, and the 43s were built by North British Locomotive Company, NBL. Now, when they were going over the designs for the diesel locomotives overall, Swindon decided not to cut corners, basically, with the overall positioning of things, as well as the materials they were using for the parts that they were putting into it. NBL did cut corners. They used mild steel for the exhaust manifolds, which was prone to fracture, so that was good. Their piston ring life expectancy was severely decreased. Oh, and they also screwed up their math when they converted from metric to imperial. And it meant that a lot of the measurements for basically everything in the locomotive were slightly off by, like, decimal points. And I know that doesn't sound like a big deal, but as any mechanical engineer can tell you, no, that's a huge deal. You cannot just no, that's not okay. So basically the end result is that the Class 43 warships were terrible. Bizarrely, were actually used a lot by British Rail despite their unreliability. And it was probably because that when they were working, they weren't capable of hauling long-distance passenger trains really well when they were working, which was rare. But when they were, they could do it. But they were all withdrawn by the early 70s and replaced with other things that were, in theory, better, but it's British Rail, so who knows. And none of these survived into preservation. The Great Western Railway 111, also called the Great Bear. What a grand-looking steam locomotive. And I honestly hate that I have to put it on the list, because I mentioned it in the last video. And, you gotta give it this. And everything we talked about so far, the Great Bear looks phenomenal. I mean, that is a gorgeous-looking steam train. But was it good? No. No, of course not. We've been over this. Anytime something appears on this list and it looks nice, it really does only look nice. Because there's been a lot of that, where a lot of trains look great. But that doesn't mean they function. And in fact, its grand size were largely part of its issues. The overall design didn't take into account the effects that would have, and the result is that the tube and barrel length of 23 feet meant that it had no efficiency. Like, it looked great and big and grand, but it was completely inefficient when it came to overall power output, as well as keeping steam pressure. Now, it could run and do things, but the biggest issue it had was that it didn't outperform anything else available on the rails at the time. Its best trait was that it served as a convincing, pretty centerpiece for the Great Western Railway, because the engine does look very nice, and that was often what it was used for. It was for public relations. Especially considering this was, at the time, one of the few Pacifics on British lines. It wasn't until later that they would add more of those designs overall. The Great Bear was eventually rebuilt as a 460, called the Castle class. In that form it was actually pretty decent, and it would serve till 1953 when it was scrapped. The South African class Afro 4000. Oh boy, another recent example? Oh, goody. Built for the Passenger Rail Agency of South Africa, or PRASA, as we'll call it, because I am not saying every single individual word like a crazy person. And they were meant to be the latest thing for South African rail lines. And to be fair, in its own way, anywhere else in the world, the 4000s aren't actually that bad. There's nothing inherently special about them necessarily, but they don't actually have a history of severe malfunction generally. So what gives? Why is it even on this list? Well, I want to stress that I am specifically referring to the South African version of the Afro 4000s. Now, the story runs a little deep in terms of government corruption and corporate deviousness again, just like last time, so I'm going to try to give you the abridged version again. You are likely familiar with the concept of gauges, like railway gauges. They even use those in toy train, HO gauge, stuff like that. Well, they do the same thing with actual trains. Every train has to be gauged for the lines it's running on. A lot of people assume this just means the distance between the two rails on any given track. And that is part of it, but it also takes into account height. Different railways have different height requirements. The reason for this can involve a few things: the position of the signals, the wires they use for electrification for the lines, or tunnel height. Either way, any engine has to be rated and gauged appropriately for the lines it's supposed to be running on. Due to a bunch of corrupt officials, both involving the South African government, as well as involving Swifambo Rail Leasing, which was just a front for black economic empowerment, brokered the whole thing and used a Spanish manufacturer to create these engines, meant that they didn't actually bother to gauge these diesels at all. They could run on the rails, but when they actually did tests to see if they could fit on the lines, specifically underneath the pantographs, which is super relevant, they were found to only clear these lines by 10 millimeters, or 3/8 of an inch, which is cutting it way, way too close. That is in no way within safety parameters. When they attempted to run these things, this height issue actually caused an accident, almost killing the crew on board. After that decision was made to just not run them at all because they weren't built for the lines. You can't call a train good if it can't even run on the rails safely. You run them forward and then you smack into something. Like, that's not normal. That shouldn't happen ever. According to my sources, the courts actually ruled in favor of South Africa in this case, regarding the state of these trains, and said that the company has to refund the money and take the trains back, though the process of recouping that loss apparently has yet to begin. As far as I can tell, the trains are still sitting down there, so, we'll see what happens. Exciting, I think. No, the opposite. The Pennsylvania Railroad Class FF1. Now, I feel a little guilty putting the FF1 on here because, in the technical sense, it's not a bad locomotive at all. And in fact, it was almost too good for the railroad at the time, was kind of the issue. The FF1 was nicknamed Big Liz because she was a biggin'. She was very large. The wheel arrangement would technically be a 2662 in 2 half frames that were connected at the center. And she was electric, built in 1917. At the time, the Pennsylvania Railroad was still kind of experimenting with electric locomotives. It was still kind of newish in that era. So Big Liz was meant to test the waters a little bit more to see how things could work out. And she didn't work out, but not because of anything that should be obvious. So the issue that Big Liz had here was not due to reliability or technical issues or, failures or anything like that. She was, for her time, way too powerful. And it's a weird thing to say, but I have said it before on this list, and that is a thing that does occur. It is possible for a locomotive to just be too strong, and that was definitely Big Liz's issue. For one thing, she was so powerful that she tended to break the couplers that were being used back then. So that was the first issue. When they realized that they were never going to get this to work because she kept snapping everything, they decided to try to use her as a pusher. And it wasn't obvious. A pusher, pushes the train instead of pulling it, which is fine. Big Liz was so powerful that whenever she pushed a train, she tended to pop the middle cars out of placement, like derail them on turns, because she pushed so hard. And it was one of those situations where even if you could throttle her in a way where she wasn't pushing or pulling way too hard, there was no need for the amount of power that she held. It was just completely unnecessary. To her credit, while she wound up being pretty much useless for the railroad and she was cut up for scrap in 1940, she did pave the way for electrification on the Pennsylvania Railroad. She made the higher-ups realize the potential of electric power, eventually resulting in the magnificent GG1, which served for nearly 50 years. So let's all raise a glass to the GG1's grandma, because do not mess with this woman, she will absolutely break your frickin' neck. The Pennsylvania Railroad Class Q1.
Oh, we're sticking with PA right now. Apparently I'm picking on my country for the moment. Alright. I mean, it's fine. I just didn't realize we had that many bad trains around here. I'm sure I'll go overseas shortly. Don't you think you guys have been, left out of the equation? Wouldn't want you feeling like you were perfect in every conceivable way, because Lord knows we aren't. Q1 was a single experimental steam locomotive designed for dual service. What does that mean? Well, basically they wanted the locomotive to be able to handle both passenger and freight trains. The high-speed passenger trains doing express runs, as well as the low-speed, very, very heavy freight trains. Okay, fine. She was a duplex, an actual real duplex. I genuinely mean that. I'm not getting it wrong this time. She genuinely was a duplex, rigid frame locomotive, but she was a little weird because her wheel arrangement was 4-6-4-4. Her driving wheels were two different amounts, which is a little unusual. I mean, it's not like the worst thing in the world, but it's definitely bizarre. Q1 was also given some streamlining that could be removed for both passenger and freight service. Streamlining for passenger, unnecessary for freight service. The thing about streamlining, especially removable streamlining that isn't built into the locomotive, means that maintenance costs are always higher. You have to remove the streamlining to do anything with the inner workings. So that was a problem on its own. But the major issue with the Q1 is that it was so expensive for not nearly the output they were expecting. Now, duplexes are generally powerful, and the Q1 was, but the amount of cost in terms of maintenance absolutely was in no way worth it. Her rear cylinders were actually mounted behind the rear driving wheels, next to the firebox, not the other way around, as with most locomotives. This is a problem because the heat and soot and everything that comes with a firebox tended to make the cylinders wear much quicker. And because they were mounted next to each other, both the firebox and the cylinders could only be a certain size because they constrained each other. It was not really the way to go when it came to anything. There was no reason to make it this way. On top of that, her steam pipes were actually too long. Now, you can make steam pipes as long as these were, but not with a firebox as small as the Q1 had. There has to be an even amount, and the combination meant that power output, when it was gained, was incredibly difficult to work with, so her operating costs were through the frickin' roof. To her credit, she did pave the way for the Q2, which, while it didn't last very long due to dieselization, was much better. So, I guess you could say that much. The DBAG Class 605, otherwise known as the, I'm about to get in trouble, ICE TD. Some people get mad that I call these trains ICE, because you're supposed to say each individual letter, apparently. I didn't know that. I always read them off as ICE. But apparently you're supposed to say ICE. But just so we're clear, I am definitely going to keep saying ICE this whole time because of force of habit. It's just something that's going to happen. Alright, I just want to warn everybody now. But we all know what we're talking about. So semantics, okay? The ICE TD, see I did it right that time, was supposed to be the latest and greatest version of the German ICE trains. The high-speed rail line intercity express system was an insane victory for the German people as a whole, as well as the rail network. They were great, they were awesome, and the TDs were not at all. They were a major misstep. It's also worth mentioning that unusually for the ICE trains that are generally known as high-speed electric lines, these were diesel electric, which might explain some of the missteps. Now, they could go very fast, 200 kilometers an hour, or 124 miles per hour. So, it wasn't like they couldn't do high speeds, but they were plagued with technical problems when they were introduced in 2001, most of which were just never resolved. And by technical problems, I mean that one of them broke an axle in 2002. After a year of service, an axle just broke. Which is... No, what? How did it... What? It didn't help that there was a diesel tax for their fuel, which meant that their operating costs were much higher than they would have been if they were just electric, like most of the ICEs. But as a slight footnote here, and you guys are gonna love this, remember when I talked about the DSB and the IC4s, the ones that, were horrible and terrible and didn't work? So the TDs were loaned off to the DSB as temporary replacements for their aging IC3s because the IC4s were so delayed. Which, I never thought with one of these lists I'd get a crossover like that, but yeah, because the IC4s were so bad, the DSB had to settle for these other high-speed diesel trains that were also really bad. You can't make this up. The offer was even given to the DSB to buy the ICE TDs, and they said, no, we spent enough money on bad trains, we're not doing that again, which is a fair answer. I'll give them that. By 2017, the vast majority of the TDs already entered retirement. Only one is still technically in service as an advanced train lab that serves as a test bed for new technologies. And as far as I can tell, it's still operating like that, and for no other reason. So, going the way of the Kobo, I guess, fair enough. The British Rail Class 23. Oh. Oh, do I exist only to suffer? Why? Why must you fail me so often? The British Rail Class 23 was yet another diesel that was commissioned and manufactured in accordance to a contract orchestrated by British Rail. They were built by the English Electric Company in 1959. They are also known as baby Deltics, because outwardly they are very similar to the Class 55 Deltic locomotives, but they are roughly half the length. They are smaller, very adorable that way. But the question is, of course, were they any good? And I don't know why you'd dare ask me such a question at this point. Because it has been 8 lists, and at least 8 times. Actually, technically more than that, because there were a few multi-entries that I've had to discuss British Rail in the late 50s and 60s. And talk about their diesels, and it's wearing on me. It's a problem. What was wrong with Class 23? What was wrong with the adorable baby Deltics? Well, once again, they had reliability issues, and in their case, it was just everything. No, seriously, according to my research, so much failed on them that they couldn't even draw a consistent problem with them. It seemed like with their build quality and parts within them, random failures just seemed to happen all the time. It was estimated they could only reach 40,000 to 60,000 miles each, including stopping, before something went wrong. In fact, at one point, during one of the inquiries, I literally looked into how many of the engines were out of commission at that given time. Mind you, only 10 of these were ever built. And at the time of the inquiry, 4 of them were out of commission due to engine trouble. So 40% of the fleet was out of commission at that moment. And this was considered normal, because for most locomotives of any kind, no, that's not normal. Like, maybe the ratio's skewed because there were so few of them, but also, this is ridiculous. There's no reason why these diesels should have this many problems. And it was anything from overheating, to fractured cylinder liners, to turbocharger bearing failures, to seized pistons due to poor cooling caused by chemical erosion from incorrect lubricants, which actually doesn't sound like the diesel's fault. That sounds like your maintenance guy's fault, but whatever, that's just my opinion. The Class 23 did not last particularly long. By the late 60s, and the introduction of their latest National Traction Plan, which was meant to rationalize the number and types of diesel locomotives because they had ordered so many of them, the idea of keeping the baby Deltics around was unrealistic. There were already only 10 of them, so getting rid of them was pretty easy. Almost all of them were scrapped, although one of them worked test trains for the Railway Technical Center until 1975, and then it was cut up in 1977. As for preservation, well, sort of. One of the baby Deltics' engines, like their core components, was actually kept around as a spare, and a group of rail fans formed the Baby Deltic project to actually rebuild a Class 23 out of a Class 37. And they're still in process, but they've sort of succeeded into recreating a Baby Deltic, so, I mean, I guess that's a win, but also, just, British Rail. No, really, this bothers me. You are a government entity, and every so often I get the odd comment where someone defends you. Okay? And you know what? I'm not trying to attack the UK as a whole. What my issue is how many tax dollars, euros, pounds, whatever, did you spend buying, contracting, and purchasing diesels that were worthless? How much money did you waste? I just want everyone to consider that the next time you think about yelling at me about targeting British Rail, because seriously, this is not okay. None of this has been okay. I just want us to acknowledge that. That's all I want anymore. And I just want the pain to stop. The Shining Zeppelin. Or Rail Zeppelin. Okay, so where to even begin here? This, rail car, yes, we're gonna go with that, was created in 1929 by Franz Krukenberg, who is notable for being an aircraft engineer, if that wasn't clear. Now you may notice something odd about it, in that the propulsion method is rather unique for any kind of rolling stock, particularly on rails, or really anything on the ground. It indeed uses a propeller, a prop, just like on an airplane. And this, well, it worked, to its credit. It did go forward, and in fact set a land speed record for a petrol-powered railcar. On the 21st of June 1931, it was clocked at going 143 miles per hour, 230.2 kilometers an hour, which even today is absurdly fast. No question about it. But to be honest, the speed was only possible not necessarily because of the propeller, but because of the car's low weight. This thing only weighed 20 tons, which I know when you say it sounds like a lot, but that is so much lighter than the vast majority of other anything on the rails at all, particularly locomotives. Now, the Shining Zeppelin was never actually put into production. The reason for this is actually quite simple. There is an incredible risk of, serious bodily injury because of the obvious, deadly spinning blades in the rear of it. Everyone was worried about safety issues with this thing. Like, anyone who saw it, yeah, okay, it's cool. It is very cool. Looks like a mad science project gone way over the line. We already discussed how cool the whole jet power train thing was. Like, those were cool too. But, similar issues. Loud propellers, danger, because they're much lower. Like, at least the jet-powered rail cars had the good sense to mount the jets on top of the rail car, so it was very unlikely that someone would be injured by it. The propeller is literally spinning right next to where people stand. It didn't help that at the time, it was so fast that most of the rail lines couldn't necessarily account for the speed and guarantee safety. The potential of it flying off the rails was not something that people didn't consider. It was a concern. Also, and this may sound really silly, but hear me out on this, it couldn't go uphill very well. Since it relied directly on airflow for its propulsion, it meant that the flow would actually separate when full power was applied, which was necessary on any kind of grade. A steep enough grade meant that the railcar actually wouldn't go anywhere because it couldn't build up enough thrust due to the way aerodynamics work. On a plane, this doesn't happen because they're in the sky, but because it was against the ground and going up, it meant that it just couldn't. On a straight shot, level ground, oh yeah, you can go really fast. But the second you make it go uphill, it starts to struggle. And then the notion came up, well, then we have to make it so that it can run off of something else, like a diesel or electric or something. But then the second you do that, you increase the weight and make the point of risking everyone's heads with a giant rotating propeller completely pointless. There's no reason to do it that way. So the project was effectively abandoned, and it was dismantled in 1939.
The Bombardier Alstom HHP8, which I have not determined an effective way to abbreviate, so I'm just going to say the P8 just for clarity, but we all know what we're talking about. This is an electric locomotive that was manufactured by, well, a consortium of Bombardier Transportation and Alstom for Amtrak and MARC. MARC, by the way, stands for Maryland Rail Commuter. It is a smaller regional railway within the United States, much like Amtrak is a large-scale railway, the national railway system in the United States. Now, a major part of Amtrak's system is the Northeast Corridor, which is a 457-mile or 735-kilometer line between Washington, D.C. and Boston, Massachusetts, which also passes through New York City. It is their crowning point. It is easily their busiest line of rail in the entire country. And in the 90s, they spent significant time and effort to electrify the lines. However, they didn't actually have the rolling stock necessary to utilize electric locomotives on the lines, which I would imagine would have been a thing they would have thought of well before they did that. But anyway, the point was they wanted to stop using diesel locomotives on the Northeast Corridor. They wanted to use electric, which is fine. So they contacted Bombardier and Alstom, who have made excellent locomotives in the past, to create a new locomotive for them. The result was the HHP8. And it was not great. It was just not at all. Now, when they were working well, they really were pretty decent. They were very fast, they were efficient, they were fine, when they were working, but like with anything that I talk about on this list, that really is the, tipping point there when it's working. The P8s only served Amtrak for a decade due to their horrific reliability issues. In fact, 15 units were withdrawn from service in 2002 because they were cracked components in their trucks, which is horrifying, actually. Amtrak just couldn't deal with constantly having to fix them, and they weighed the option of refurbishing them, but opted to replace them entirely instead, mostly with the Siemens ACS-64, which turned out a lot better. As for MARC, they actually refurbished their P8s and are still using them. After going through that multi-year process, they have turned out to be a lot better after the necessary fixes were made. So I guess you could say if you see one now, it's probably fine. But when they were introduced, no, not at all. It's the opposite of that. The United States Army Transportation Corps S-160 class. This is a weird one because this was actually a pretty prevalent locomotive manufactured, and it got dispatched to a lot of different countries, and in some instances, they were actually perfectly fine. So I am referring to a very specific set of these that was introduced to the UK by us, and you're welcome, by the way. I don't think anyone's going to thank me after this, but we'll get to that. As far as the details go, the S-160s were two 8-2 consolidation steam locomotives. Consolidation refers to that wheel arrangement, 280. Every single locomotive that had that wheel arrangement generally was called a consolidation. And overall, the consolidations were pretty decent locomotives despite not having trailing wheels. They had significant tractive effort and did what they did pretty well. But the S-160s are a weird case because you may recognize that these particular locomotives were manufactured by the United States Army Transportation Corps, USATC. The USATC funded the design and creation of these locomotives specifically for the need for more rolling stock during World War II. They were all manufactured between 1942 and 1945, and the S-160s were designed for speedy manufacturing, not actual working longevity. Now, they could do their job pretty well for a short amount of time, maybe a few years tops. But they weren't designed for longevity. Like, these were very much throwaway engines. And in that context, it's hard to call them bad because, yeah, okay, I get why they would have been manufactured in that way. Obviously, the intent was to just get these things out so, other countries could use them because that was the other thing they were for. They were sent to a whole slew of nations, Africa, Asia, all of Europe, and South Africa. They were all over the place. And one of the places that actually took them was the UK. The UK had plenty of steam engines on their own, obviously, but they could have used more because, again, World War II, they were busy. They had to. As we've discussed in previous videos, many of the engines they were still using, actually, they were supposed to be retired, and they had to put them back into service because they just needed more rolling stock to move stuff around. So we, being the generous Americans that we are, decided to send you guys a bunch of S-160s, and I am so sorry. I know I said you're welcome earlier, but yeah, because we managed to do some friendly fire with these things. Here was the problem. Regarding the specific UK version of the S160s. Due to the compromises when it came to designing them for quick assembly and not longevity, the axle box grease lubricators were not very efficient, and usually when maintenance procedures lapsed or were delayed in a war situation, like they were, I don't know why we didn't think about that, the axle boxes ran really, really hot. Braking was rather poor by modern standards because they used a Westinghouse steam brake, which was not sufficient for this type of locomotive at all. But the major fault, the biggest problem, was the use of a single water gauge for this locomotive. The design of the water gauge and the fact that there was only one was unfamiliar to UK crews, and because of the gauge's design, it was necessary to open the top and bottom cocks slowly or the check valves would close. This traps the water in the gauge and gives a false reading. And as we've discussed before through other videos involving steam explosions, you may notice that not knowing how much water is in your steam locomotive is actually a very, very, very dangerous thing. So dangerous, in fact, that in the span of 10 months, 3 of the UK S160s suffered crown sheet failures, which killed at least 1 fireman. And I know historically I have made it a point to throw shade at British Rail, but this one's totally on us, guys. I'm gonna be real with you. They weren't even really built that well by our standards, and then you got them, and then the gauges were weird, and then they blew up, and we didn't mean to do that. And wow, this is awkward for me. I didn't make them. You can't yell at me. The British Rail Class 50. You know, I don't even know what I expect anymore. Other than this exact thing. You know, it's really normal. And honestly, after that last entry, I would feel really awkward getting mad now because, you know, you had a lot of bad diesels, guys, but I mean, so far their ineptitude didn't kill anybody, as far as I can remember. So, you know, well, I'm gonna give them a pass today. Because, to be fair, the Class 50 is not as bad as a lot of the other diesels I've talked about by British Rail. They were manufactured at about the same time. Diesel-electric locomotives, like always. Coco wheel layout. And they were okay, and lasted into the 90s, which is actually pretty impressive for a diesel manufactured between 1967 and 68. But they did suffer from serious reliability issues, like every single British Rail contracted diesel that was ever designed in the 60s, I swear. I know some of you have pointed out that there were a few that were good, and you're right, there were like 4. And also, that is a woeful comparison considering all the stuff they just threw out there. They just let anybody manufacture a diesel regardless of whether they were capable of it, and obviously they weren't. But the issue with the Class 50 is a little amusing to me, because overall, the actual design of the Class 50 is rather sound for any country that's not the United Kingdom. And what I mean by that is, when the reliability issues gained too much and they brought them in for refurbishment, because British Rail did opt to actually fix the problems with these diesels rather than scrap them like a lot of the ones we've talked about, they discovered the biggest issue was the reason why they had their nickname. The engines were nicknamed Hoovers because they sounded like a vacuum cleaner. And no one ever bothered to really check why that was doing that, and they finally figured it out when they, took them in and tried to refurbish them. The problem was the air intake, which, again, was fundamentally totally fine for a non-humid environment. I don't know if this is news to anybody, but it totally rains in the United Kingdom. In fact, according to my sources, it actually rains quite a bit in the United Kingdom. It's actually a very normal thing there for it to rain. And the extra humidity in the UK that was not taken into account when it came to designing this particular locomotive meant that the particles in the air, the moisture, actually gummed up the works, causing what was at the time a state-of-the-art electronic system to fail just all the time. When they refurbished them, they actually didn't have this problem, but even after refurbishment, they had a weird issue of wheel slip, which is bizarre for a Coco. I'm not even sure how you do that. But, like I said, the Class 50s did last a significantly longer amount of time than most of the diesels I've discussed before, especially when it comes to British Rail. They did fix them, and they did wind up being alright overall in the end, but that initial startup with the moisture thing was way too funny for me not to mention. I mean, come on. I've never read such a thing in my life. You guys didn't think about that it's wet out there? You guys live in the UK! The manufacturer was English Electric! Come on! Just saying. Just saying. And please don't throw the S-160s back in my face after this. I don't want to talk about those. The Cycloped. You know, I really had to weigh my options when it came to putting this one on the list because I was on the fence as to how much that counts as a locomotive at this point. I mean, it technically does have the conveyor that drives the wheels, so it's, you know, a little more than just a horse and cart. But ultimately, it really is just a horse and buggy. Like, you might as well have the horse pull it. And that's kind of the Cycloped's problem. It was built by Thomas Shaw Brandreth of Liverpool. Yes, England, this was your idea. And at the time, people were experimenting with a whole bunch of different, you know, locomotive designs. And apparently, Thomas thought that horsepower should be taken very literally, and that you should still use beasts of burden in a locomotive, which, I'm sorry, I thought the whole point of the invention of the steam engine was to avoid using the horse at all. And it really is a dirt simple design if you think about it. It really is just a treadmill that the horse moves on that moves the wheels forward. But it doesn't have a capacity that's any better than if you just had the horse pull it. It literally doesn't change anything. Thomas Brandreth was actually one of the directors of the railway at the time, and this was his idea, so he wanted it in the competition against a bunch of other designs, all of which used steam power, and all of which went faster than the Cycloped. Because of course they did. This idea was never gonna work out. This is the silliest thing I've seen. I mean, there were some weird designs when it came to early locomotives, I get that, but even for the era, this seems like a step backwards, don't you think? It's like the laziest idea possible, like, well, if we want to do direct drive wheels, let's just put the horse on the cart and make it drive it that way. No, Tom, that's not what we're talking about, and it didn't work. There were actually 2 other attempts to do it this way, both of which also did not work nearly as well as just using a steam engine like you should have done in the first place, but hey, it makes for a good talking point. Heck of a curiosity, I'll give it that. I'll give you that, Tom. You're welcome. The Holman Horror. What the word I cannot say on this family-friendly show. There's so much wrong with this image, and it's one of those things that you look at, and the longer you look at it, the more it gets worse. The more questions that are raised. Okay, so this locomotive was built by the Holman Locomotive Company in 1887 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And anyone who saw this thing actually had a knowledge of locomotive dynamics and designs and engineering immediately threw shade at this thing. So you may be looking at this and wonder, how does this work? What's the point of it? Okay, I'll tell you how it works in terms of drive. It is quite literally just a regular American steam locomotive. Except that the driving wheels, well, all the wheels, have been put on top of other wheels, which have been put on top of other wheels, and then those wheels are on the track. So they've just stacked wheels on wheels here. And you may be wondering why they did that. Well, the Holman Company said that this is because they thought that this would make the locomotive run faster, which it will not. It will do not that at all. You'd be lucky if it went the same speed, let alone faster. And some of you might be defending this. Maybe this is an early attempt at a gearing system, because some of you defended the Fontaine that way and said maybe he was trying to make a gearing system. And geared locomotives do have a place when it comes to rail history. I haven't talked about them yet, and you're right, but that is so not what Holman was going for here. And I will tell you why, because evidence came out that the whole reason why the Holman locomotive was created at all in this weird, insane way that you can't possibly look away from is because they were trying to attract ignorant investors to a company that was effectively a front for a scam, basically. This engine did function poorly, but it was never intended to function at all, really. It was meant to garner interest from people who didn't know any better, so they would give the Holman Locomotive Company their money, so Holman and his cohorts could then run away with said money, never to be seen again. How much money did they get away with using this scheme? It's unclear. We don't really know. But we do know they attempted to do it again 10 years later, so I guess they thought lightning struck twice. And incredibly, the second time around, they actually convinced Baldwin, of all people, to manufacture it. The second attempt. Yes, really, that Baldwin. Like, actually respected Baldwin that made a ton of great steam locomotives. They made the second bout of this monstrosity. Eventually, the engine was returned to Baldwin, who converted it into a regular American and then resold it, because of course they did. And I'm still lost on the fact that not only did someone attempt this, but it actually kind of worked, apparently twice, because no one was ever brought to trial, no one was ever sued as far as anybody knows. They literally got in their investment money and then disappeared. Wow, I don't know whether to be offended or impressed by that, but as a result, we have one of the worst designs I've ever seen for a steam locomotive. And I would argue, in fact, that if it weren't for the notion that this was made poor on purpose just to look weird, it might be the worst steam locomotive ever on the basis of sheer pointlessness. Because yeah, it didn't hurt anybody, it didn't explode or anything like that, but it literally doesn't do anything, and it wasn't out of ignorance, it was out of a way to scam people. And there's something about that that just rubs me the wrong way. But that's just my thoughts. Fowler's Ghost. This is an odd one, and I put it low on the list only because this was an experimental locomotive. And some people have called me out on this, saying that, is it fair to include experiments on these lists? Because they're experiments, you know. Sometimes during experimentation, you get things wrong, and that's how you learn. And you're right. But it doesn't mean the locomotive was good, though. Like, all the experiments that I've talked about on these lists were inherently flawed. They're giving me leeway to talk about it. And not to be fair, we all like to hear a good experiment story. It's fun. Fowler's Ghost is actually a nickname given to an experimental fireless 240 steam locomotive. It was designed by John Fowler and built in 1861. So this was a fairly early steam locomotive. Now, John Fowler was a respected structural and mechanical engineer. He was good at what he did, and the reason why this locomotive is called Fowler's Ghost is that he was kind of ashamed of it. Why was that? Well, it was just a disaster. And I already mentioned this thing was supposed to be fireless, which sounds really weird for a steam locomotive. After all, how can you create steam without a source of heat? Well, it did have a source of heat. Instead of an open flame, this locomotive used fire bricks for the heat, which are usually made of a ceramic material that can retain a tremendous amount of heat for their size. Now, the engine worked on a twofold mechanism. There were the fire bricks, yes, but a big part of this locomotive was the idea of reusing condensed steam instead of just releasing it like a conventional locomotive would. Such a system was ambitious, but it was just a bit too overly complicated. Fowler's Ghost also had one major design flaw that almost led to a steam explosion. During one of its 2 trial runs, the boiler feed pumps jammed, which caused the boiler to run low on water. You may recognize this as very dangerous. We've talked about steam explosions in the past. But the problem was, the Fowler was designed in such a way where it couldn't actually get rid of the source of the heat. On a conventional locomotive, in an emergency situation where the crew is aware of the possibility of an explosion, they can always drop the fire out of the locomotive, onto the tracks. The fire would simply burn out on the tracks and not cause a problem for anything, while the steam engine was able to cool down while they sorted out why they couldn't get water into the boiler. But the Fowler actually had no way to do this. The bricks were too hot to remove by hand, and there was no way to get them out of the locomotive. So the crew was terrified the thing was going to blow up. Fortunately, that did not occur, but this issue, combined with the fact that it never really steamed very well, showed that it was flawed to the point of really no saving it. Originally, they planned on rebuilding it into a conventional locomotive, and it probably would have been fine like that, but ultimately it was scrapped. Fowler actually denied its existence for years, but don't feel too bad for him. Sir John Fowler did wind up designing another set of locomotives later, 440 tank engines, that were known as the A-Class, and after updates, the B-Class, and were actually incredibly successful. They were very good in their day, so he definitely made up for his ghost's embarrassment in the end. The Soviet locomotive class OR-23 was a 210-4 locomotive produced in 1949. Now, you may look at it and think, well, that looks very Russian, but what's so weird about it? Looks fine. Look a little bit closer. You see something odd? Yep, that's looking pretty weird. Okay, explanation. This was another experimental locomotive that was designed to operate its pistons in a very bizarre way. Instead of the normal setup, where the pistons would be either to the left or sometimes to the right of the locomotive's driving wheels, these ones were over top. And through a relatively complicated system, actually operated two sets of rods that worked the wheels in one direction in tandem. Why would they want to do this? Well, the idea was to reduce hammer blow. It's a vertical force which alternately adds to and subtracts from the locomotive's weight on a wheel. Some of you may know this as dynamic augment, which is what we call it in America. But either way, it's the same thing. And all conventional steam locomotives have the effect to a certain degree. If it's bad enough, it can damage the locomotive or the track. And any development of any steam locomotive has to take it into account. The thought process was that this would balance the driving forces on the wheels, making the counterweights a bit smaller and reduce hammer blow overall. The problem was that it just didn't work. It was too complicated for its own good. Anything they may have gained from restricting hammer blow wasn't worth it for all the other mechanical problems the machine had. It's an interesting idea, I give it that, definitely unique, but ultimately it was for naught, and the locomotive was ultimately scrapped. The General Electric P30CH, sometimes called the Pooch, because of the way the numbers read out. If you look at that in leet speak, it looks like Pooch. So I'm going to call it Pooch, because P30CH is kind of a mouthful. Now, from the get-go, I actually kind of like these things, because they're so just square. Like, they look like a diesel you'd make out of Minecraft blocks, you know what I mean? Or Legos or something. Like, it's just so cubey. But it's distinctive, instantly recognizable as a result. And they were produced specifically for Amtrak, built between 1976 and 1977. Only 25 were ever made for Amtrak, and to be fair, at first they were actually very good. General Electric diagnosed and corrected a lot of the early problems that the model faced, which were basically down to growing pains. Like, that happens. There's some minor defects that sometimes occurs whenever a new locomotive is introduced. That's totally normal. The problem was that after a few months of service, they began to reveal their actual problems. Many of their parts and mechanical features just couldn't hold up over time. They suffered crankshaft failures, traction motor malfunctions, bad axle configurations, which resulted in uneven weight distribution, so that's great. And the dynamic brakes actually had serious response issues, which is horrifying, actually. That was not a thing you would want, ever. They served for a little over 10 years, but by 1992 they were ultimately scrapped. And they were often reassigned to smaller commuter service, which is the opposite of what they were meant for. They were supposed to be for long-distance trains, being replaced by, and we've mentioned these before, the EMD F40PH, which, as I've mentioned, were only supposed to be for short commuter trains, yet turned out to be incredible at pretty much everything they were assigned to do. They were good diesels, and yes, the Pooch was one of the two diesels that it wound up picking up the slack for, the other one being the SDP40F, which I've mentioned on a previous list. British Rail Class 141. You know, they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And I keep making these lists, expecting you to not appear. And every time, I am made a fool. It's a terrible fact. Fact of life. Now you may look at these and think, wait a minute. Are you cheating, History in the Dark? This is a pacer! And yes, you're right, you got me. Technically speaking, you could argue that I've already talked about this locomotive, because in my very, very first episode of this series, that was actually never meant to go past the first one, but here we are, I spoke about the sweeping term pacer trains, which refers to a family of multiple British rail classes. The 140s, the 141, 142, 143, and 144 are all the pacers, diesel multiple unit rail buses. Therefore, you could argue that I've already discussed this. However, you don't understand. This one deserves a very, very special place, its own topic to go into, because it is unique among the pacers. First of all, this is the first one that was mass-produced. The OG. The Alpha. the Omega. The one that sired them all! Actually, that technically would go to the 140, which was the original prototype for the Pacers, but only one of those were ever made, and believe it or not, the prototype is actually better than the mass-produced 141. So, I'm gonna give the 140 a pass, because the 141's problems were... well, okay, here's the deal with the 141. Remember how I even admitted it in the first part, and some people have mentioned this to me, how I'm not being fair to the Pacers, because, yeah, they're a pain to ride on, nobody likes them, they're uncomfortable, noisy, blah, 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 I get it, but you're right when you say that they were created to fix a major problem that British Rail was suffering from, and that was finances. They needed to keep these branch lines open, but they couldn't do it with a more expensive locomotive. The Pacers were meant to be a stopgap to keep the trains running while they figured out a more permanent solution. It lasted way longer than that, but the 141 is kind of an exception to that excuse. Why do I say this? Well, okay, A, they were uncomfortable. Nobody liked them, blah, blah, blah. You know that about Pacers already. But what you don't know is that one of the major issues with the 141 in particular is that it wasn't cheap. At least not nearly as cheap as they were hoping it would be. See, when the 140 was put through trials, a lot of flaws that they knew they had to fix were realized. And that makes sense. It was a prototype, so of course they're going to figure out that there's these problems. But when they analyzed the cost of actually mass-producing the 140s, as ultimately what the 141s would be, they discovered something alarming, that the cost-saving measures that they initially put into the 140 were no longer there. The 141 wasn't very cheap to produce at all. So it wasn't even doing the one thing that Pacers were good at, and that was saving British Rail money. There's a reason why they only produced 20 of these things, whereas the Pacers' immediate follow-up, the 142, had a total of 96 units produced. In fact, I double-checked just to make sure, and every single Pacer that isn't the 141 or the 140, which was the prototype and that only produced one of those, that doesn't count, every single mass-produced Pacer had more of it produced than the 141, because the 141 wasn't doing the one thing Pacers were supposed to do, and that was save money. So, I think it kind of deserves a very special spot here for being not just a Pacer train. Come on, 141, you guys had one job, I'm just saying. The Lartigue Monorail. Okay. In fairness, this was a very early idea, and some people suggest I put monorails in general on this list, and I don't feel like that's necessarily right. They have a place, especially modern ones. The technology has evolved quite a bit, and while you can't use them on necessarily a very large scale, for regional services or amusement park rides, because Lord knows almost every amusement park has at least one of them, they're not bad. It's just that utilizing a monorail setup, which, as the name implies, has one rail as opposed to the usual two, comes with its inherent flaws. I mean, yeah, it has the potential to be faster, the balancing is worked out, and you have to pay less for infrastructure since you're only putting down one rail, but Lartigue's monorail is a bit unique. And I don't want to come down on him too hard. He was a French engineer. He was a creative guy with a million ideas in his head, as an engineer tends to be, and he was trying to do something distinctive with the technology. So I don't want to come down on him personally, but okay, here's the issue with this thing. First of all, it defeats the purpose of a monorail, which is to be A, faster, B, more cost-effective. You may think it looks really bizarre, because it is. And the reason for that is that the way this works is that there's actually two boilers and two fireboxes. The idea was to even out the weight. So instead of balancing a single boiler in the middle of a single rail, you'd have two that even each other out. And that's actually a pretty intelligent idea to work with here. But the thing about monorails is that, first of all, you have to worry about that balancing thing. That's always a concern, especially with smaller monorails like this one, where those rails aren't any bigger than a normal rail would be. And to his credit, one of his railways, which was set up in Ireland, did run for 26 years, but it was really only ever a novelty, because these aren't even true monorails. If you notice, there are actually two rails near the bottom. Those aren't there for support. Well, they are, but not for the struts, for the engine. He could never get it to balance out properly, so sometimes it would lean to one side. The extra rails were there as stopgaps in case it leaned too far. So it wasn't even really a monorail, since he had to put 3 rails on it to make it work. The other issue is that his monorail design was elevated. You couldn't put proper crossings on these like with a conventional railway. For a road to cross, you had to set up some kind of drawbridge scenario and required an attendant to operate it. It was way more impractical in that regard, which kind of defeated the purpose of simplifying the railway, don't you think? And again, I don't want to sneer at it from his effort. It's clear that Lartigue was just trying something unique, and it is, don't get me wrong. But as a competent train setup that could be used on a massive scale, it was just never gonna work. But to a degree, Lartigue's legacy lives on. In 2003, the Lartigue Monorailway Restoration Committee actually opened a 1-kilometer section of Lartigue monorail on the trackbed of the former North Kerry line in Listowel. As a museum curiosity, it's actually quite neat, and they managed to build a replica of the original locomotive Lartigue used, although this is only designed to look like a steam engine. It's actually a diesel in disguise. But I think that's cool, keeping history alive, because while the design is inherently flawed, I do think it's actually kind of neat to look at. And to be honest, that's kind of why I do these lists. It isn't just to tear things apart and make everyone feel bad for experiments or things like that. I just want to open up history and look at the missteps or the more unique takes on railway design. Yeah, a lot of them could be called bad, doesn't mean they aren't neat, you know what I mean? Yes, you too, British Rail. Lord knows I would not be where I am if not for the meme involving you.